for coming to our seminar today, and thank you also for the people online. Let's start by acknowledging that we are today gathering in a land that has a true and traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Today we have the honor of having Professor Kari Watkins giving us the seminar to us. She is an associate professor from the University of California, Davis. She previously was at Georgia Tech. She also spent quite some years working as a professional in the transport engineering world before doing her PhD. So she has a bit of a combination of the two worlds. And she's going to talk us about this new center that they are creating for resilient transport. She's also a very good expert in public transport. So thank you very much for being here. She's just been yesterday from Australia. So
thank you. Thank you. So I will say that if you're here hoping to hear a lecture on public transportation, you're going to have to come down to Monash and see me there. I'm actually here on the way to being a visiting professor there for a couple of weeks, and Emily was gracious enough to let me talk about something different, Emily and Andres, because I'm going to be doing a lot of public transit talks over the next 2 weeks. And so for my own variety, I wanted to talk about the other big hat that I wear. So this is going to be different from a lot of talks where you hear people talking about one or maybe a couple of research projects. This is going to be an overload of many, many research projects. Just to give you an idea of this new center that we have at UC Davis. And hopefully things that I talk about will be of interest. If many of you in the room do transportation research, these things will be of interest, but we're also doing research with people who work in materials, with people who do more traffic side of things than sort of the travel behavior side that I do. So a wide range of different kinds of projects through this new center. So our center is called CERRCET. And so today I want to talk to you about sustainable transportation for a more resilient transportation system. So I think it's not, did I do something? Hey, there we go. That's my big flashy slides. Hi, I don't know what happened, but we got it now. So this may be similar to Australia. I'll talk about this from an American perspective, but essentially we've created transportation systems in the United States that are neither efficient nor sustainable. Much of our country, especially in the urban areas, often looks like this photo from Atlanta, where I was a professor for 11 years. And as an outfall of this, we have a lot of problems with the emissions from transportation. And this is also a problem that we need to be focusing on solving. And as an outfall of that, we have a lot of natural disasters that are increasing in number and intensity. This is a picture from close to where I live now in California, near Davis. And we have significant flooding problems in that area that are getting worse. In many parts of the US, we have significant flooding problems that are getting worse. Wildfires, all of these kinds of outfall from a transportation system that has not historically been sustainable. And then in addition to that, we have a transportation system that is causing a lot of problems, whether it is access to transportation, safety, dividing communities. The community perspective of how we think about transportation is critically important as well. And so it was bringing these three concepts together. That was how we modeled this new center that we're hosting at UC Davis. It's called CERRCET. And the whole idea of it is we've got this foundation of technology and innovation that we're building on. We have three different pillars, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. And the goal of this is to have research-informed policy actions. So a little different from fundamental science types of research. The whole point of this center and a lot of the work that we do in transportation at UC Davis is to be policy relevant. We do a lot of work hand in hand with city governments, counties, regions, states, trying to give them research that will allow them to put different policies in place or test the policies that they have in place to see how effective they are in changing our transportation system. And so the point of CERRCET, as I said with my intro slides, is that we have these three pillars. One on emissions reduction, one on the community impact of changing to more sustainable forms of transportation, and one on resilience and adaptation. And we have a lot of different, we call them blocks within each of these. I'm not going to go into all of these. Instead, I'm just going to sort of tell you that we have these blocks, and then I'm going to tell you about the projects that we've put within each of these pillars that have been funded in the first couple of years of the center. So before I go into all that, I should say that this is not just me. This is a pretty large center. There are many people at UC Davis who are working on various projects within it. And then we also have partners at another University of California, Riverside, at the University of Southern California, at Cal State Long Beach, at Texas Southern, and at the University of Vermont. So it's a pretty big group that we're bringing together under this center. And the whole idea of this is that, like I said, it's policy relevant. So we work with a lot of stakeholders in industry, other academics. So this is, if you're interested in some of the projects that I'm talking about, please let me know and I can put you in touch with the researchers. We work with a lot of community-based organizations, nonprofits, government, and the whole center is funded by the US Department of Transportation. So, my title is a little. So the first projects that I want to talk about are in this first pillar. They're the emissions reduction projects. And the first one is our first product that came out. If you're interested in the concept of induced demand, which I'll talk about in a second, we actually have a policy brief that you can already go and look up. That was the result of decades of research that Susan Handy and some of her more recent students, like Jamie Volker is now a researcher with us, but was a student and a postdoc of hers. And they've done a lot of research in the area of induced demand for a long time. And the whole point of this was, how do we now push this concept to policy? So the idea of induced demand is that in the US, I think similarly here, we have a long history of building large freeways. And what we've discovered over time is that if you build it, they will come. And typically the congestion mitigation effects that we think these facilities are gonna have do not happen, because within just a couple of years, we've created enough new traffic by people moving to new places, taking new routes, all of the different aspects of travel demand that we talk about, all of those happen to the point where we have a facility that is just as congested as it was before, only a couple of years after building it. And this is the concept of induced demand. We're creating new demand for this facility by virtue of constructing it. And so this is a principle that we're now using in California to move away from increasing the size of freeways. No more new lanes, because we know it's not actually mitigating congestion. There are other ways that we can give people choices instead of trying to mitigate congestion. And so that is the summary of this document. Talks about how do we integrate this concept better into travel demand models. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about some future research we're going to be doing in that area as well. The second project is my own. This one is about the integration of active modes and public transportation, two areas that I've long done a lot of research in. And the idea here is that if we want to make public transportation more competitive with automobile traffic, we have to make it easier to access public transportation. And sometimes the area around a station that you could walk to is not nearly enough. And so if we use bike as a mode, or we use other shared micromobility modes, scooters, e-bikes, things like that, then we can increase the catchment area of a transit station, and this allows us to serve a greater number of people. The point, this is actually an old graphic where we were doing some preliminary work before this study. This was with a student at Georgia Tech, where we were actually trying to develop simulation models that would show how much further you could get with the transit network if you had access coming by bike instead. And the whole point of the newer project that we're doing is we're arranging partnerships between transit agencies, particularly longer distance ones, commuter rail, our BART system, which is more a regional rail, although it's in the form of a metro. Those kinds of agencies, we're working with the local micromobility providers, Spin, Lime, all of these. I don't know what the ones, are those the same ones that you guys have? Okay. Okay. in each of the cities in which they exist to try to encourage joint fare programs between the two, and even subsidized fare programs. So you take a ride on the regional rail system and you get this free scooter trip, and you have a code in order to do so. We're trying to look at how many more transit trips someone might take if they have that kind of program in place for them to be making use of. And so that's the whole idea of this project, is to enable those partnerships, but also to look at what the actual travel behavior change is if we're the ones who are putting the money out there to subsidize it, in hopes that the transit agency eventually would take over those subsidies. So this is another one of the projects that we're working on as part of it. Now we're getting into territory where, if you guys have questions towards the end, I probably won't be able to answer them, but I'm still going to tell you about some of the cool projects that our group is doing. So this is some of our materials people. They are doing a project on quantifying the effect of re-carbonation during the use phase and end of life of concrete pavements. So the whole idea here is they're looking at storage and reuse of these pavement materials and how much carbon comes from them when they're in the middle of this process. I will probably just leave it there. And again, if you're interested, let me know and I will put you in touch with the people working on this one. We also have a piece, this is being done at UC Riverside. The idea here is that they do a lot of traffic simulation, and they're doing a lot of actual work instrumenting streets in Riverside. And so this is a scalable, low-cost, environmentally friendly adaptive traffic signal control system. And so they are actually using, this shows a picture of New York City, but they're doing this in Riverside, California, where they're collecting data from the actual street of what's happening, trying to re-simulate it, and then create new ways of, if we messed with signal control and these kinds of pieces in a much more real-time adaptive way, how much of an effect would that have on traffic and thereby emissions and other pieces that would come from that. Like I said, this is being done out of UC Riverside and also Texas Southern. And then we have a project being done by some folks at the University of Southern California, looking at an assessment of alternative fuel system supply chains. So the whole goal here is many of the supplies coming from electric vehicles today are coming from places outside of the United States, like Australia, with the great natural minerals that you have here that we need for our batteries. In the US, we don't do a lot of our own battery production, any of the pieces of it. And so the question here is if that was to change, if we were to be looking at the transport of raw materials, intermediate products that have to be exchanging in like a supply chain kind of system. So all the way from where we're getting the parts of the electric truck that we would be trying to produce, all the way to the shipping that is actually taking place. How different would this look if we were taking those, that manufacturing, all of those processes to places within the US instead of abroad? So they're looking at 4 different locations with different energy grid mixes in California, Southeast US, Northeast US, and Texas, to see like raw materials, manufacturing locations, if we were to shift some of this process to the United States instead. So those were the projects that we're doing in the emissions reduction pillar. We also have this center pillar on community impact of sustainable transportation. So the whole goal here is, how do we integrate the community better into decisions we might be making about how we make the transportation system more sustainable? And we have 3 different projects within this one. So the first one is a partnership between the University of California, Davis and the University of Southern California. The goal here, it's a community responsive approach to infrastructure risk and benefits. They're trying to do qualitative analysis, working directly with communities to try to understand how would people like to be more involved in decisions that are being made as they transition to electric vehicles, as they try to do some sort of a mode shift in their community to encourage people to be using active or public transportation more. What kind of input do they actually want to be having? and working with them to try to understand how people could be more involved in these kinds of decisions. And then in the second phase of it, it gets more quantitative, and they're doing different things, looking at risk of changes to the climate and how that might impact these communities and how they might want to be taking part in decisions if these things are happening. And then also there's different risk assessment tools that are already out there. And so they're doing a whole thing where they're trying to show differences between these tools and what it says about which communities are the most at risk and that type of thing. The next one is for more rural parts of America, something that I think you have plentifully in Australia as well. This is work that's being done at the University of Vermont, which is a much more rural part of our country. And the whole goal here is that a lot of people who live in rural areas don't necessarily have the kind of housing that they want to have. They're often living in a place that is not more of a village type atmosphere because they can't afford it or for other reasons. And their choice of housing actually very much changes transportation options available to them. And so the whole goal here is they want to understand better the types of communities in rural areas where people live and how that actually aligns with their preference for where they might live. And how that would change their access to employment, goods, services, how they travel. And they're trying to look at if there's a large dissonance between places where people live and the kind of place that they wish they could live in, where if housing stock changed, they might have something that actually meets their needs better, or other sort of barriers to making sure that they can get the kind of housing that they want to be living in and be able to make transportation choices that go with that. And then the last project in this community piece is navigating emissions reductions in tribal communities. So the whole goal here is to work directly with tribes because there's often a disconnect between the US government and the tribal governments where they're trying to provide funding to help move to more sustainable transportation modes and patterns and such. But it is hard for the US government to get involved and be able to incentivize those things. And so this is a lot more qualitative research where they're talking to tribal directors, people within tribes who work on transportation to try to understand what kinds of sustainable transportation incentives would actually be most effective, which ones are working well, things like that. So then our last pillar is about resilience and adaptation. So reacting to the greater prevalence of flooding and wildfires and these types of things. And we have one project that we have funded so far under this. Miguel Hala at UC Davis is the person who's working on this one. And it's evaluating and implementing a new standardized spatial risk index for network vulnerability. So the point of this project is that we have all of these different natural hazards. We're getting better and better at mapping those natural hazards, but we're not always good about translating that into what is the impact on the actual roadway network, and how do we make sure that the most vulnerable communities to fire, to flooding, to all of these natural disasters, that we're actually rebuilding in those communities to make them less vulnerable to these natural disasters. And so this actually uses a process where he's actually looking at the vulnerability of different communities to the hazards, but then also socio-demographic variables and the like. And he's doing it at the node level and then aggregating up to the region and the system level to create this different index. So if we put strategic investments in different places, does this bring this index down where we're doing a better job by being very strategic about the places that have the highest risk of being affected by some hazard? And so he's redeveloping this, and there's actually going to be an interactive web portal that agencies or others could use in order to aid in decision-making around this. So that was all of our first year projects that we have under the center. We actually have already gotten our second year funding and have started some of the second year projects. Most of them are starting in the next couple of months. The ones you just heard about are all kind of halfway through. But these ones are just starting out. And we have projects in both life cycle emissions and travel demand forecasting. So I'll tell you about a couple more. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I think I'm still okay. Okay. So the first one is life cycle and emissions analysis from electric vehicles. We have had a push in California and a few other states in the US to shift to electric vehicles very quickly. And it has caused a few policy issues, things Emily and I were actually talking about this morning on our way here. But one of the other things is that there is sort of this implicit assumption that an electric vehicle is going to be more sustainable. And there's a lot of yes buts in that statement. And so the whole point of this analysis is to very carefully look at the full life cycle of these vehicles, that depending on where the production emissions are coming from, so where we're taking our materials from, manufacturing of the vehicle, of the battery, the actual use of these vehicles in the system, depending on where they're being charged, the grid, where that power is coming from, all of these things, behavior, how maybe if you have an EV, you feel less guilty about driving it, so you drive more. She's trying to wrap a lot of these pieces into this life cycle analysis. And then at the end of life, what happens when we have this vehicle and this battery left compared to if it had been a gas vehicle? And so the whole goal is to look from the whole emissions life cycle to see how much more sustainable would an electric vehicle be, depending on all these different factors that are happening along the way. And then we have two more studies back to the induced demand piece that I talked about. There are two things that we're trying to do. The first is we're doing a research panel where we have 12 experts that we're going to convene and invite. And if you have suggestions, some of you in the room may have great suggestions of people who might be on this panel. The whole goal of this is to look at travel demand forecasting practices and think about how they should be evolving in the United States. So what things do models not do well, like incorporating induced demand? Or what are the outputs that come out of it? Are they actually outputs that we can use for decisions? How do we better integrate land use in travel demand? There are a lot of things that when we're doing modeling of travel demand, we do not do well currently in the United States, and I think in many other places. And so the goal of this is to convene this panel and try to think about how do we push to next generation models in the United States, or how do we do smaller tweaks to the models that we make use of today, and then organize a national convening to talk about the findings of this and try to invite more people to talk about how we push to the next level in demand forecasting. And to go with this, we're doing a study where we're looking at the predictions that we make out of demand forecast models and trying to understand how does that compare with the reality of what we see. And part of that is this freeway problem that I talked about with induced demand, where we build these facilities and they don't reduce congestion because more people travel. But part of it is also that we've historically we've oversold what transit is going to do, and our ridership levels are never as high as what the model is predicting. We've gotten better at that more recently, but there are a lot of different ways that these models are not predicting well, and trying to understand that by comparing what happens in reality to what did we say was going to happen based on the model. And so the whole point of this study is to take that real world data looking at speeds and traffic volumes and all of these pieces and compare that to what did the model say was actually going to take. So that is everything that we currently have going on at the center. Hopefully you found things of interest that I could talk a little bit more about or put you in touch with the right people. We are hoping that there will be a year 3 and beyond of the center. If there is, then we're looking to focus more on the efficiency studies, the traffic efficiency ones out of Riverside. And we're hoping to do a lot more in resiliency because we did not fund much of the resiliency work yet. So resilient design and construction for fire and flood mitigation are things that we're hoping to still be able to have new projects on. So with that, let me make one plug for ITS Davis. Whenever I travel, I like to talk about our whole institute. Not only is the work that I just talked about through our new center CERRCET part of ITS, but we have a national funded center by the US Department of Transportation in sustainable transportation. And we have many, many other research aspects that we do. So we like to call ourselves, and we haven't yet found somebody who challenges us on this, but we are the world's premier university center for sustainable transportation at ITS Davis. And we do a lot of bringing science to policy. We've been doing this for a long time with many, many different academic and faculty researchers, grad students, publications, and whatnot. And I'm happy to point you towards websites that would let you search all of the things that we've done through those many, many years. So with that, I'm happy. I know it was a lot, many, many different projects, but I'm happy to take questions about any of the individual projects or the center broadly. And thank you for letting me tell you more about it.
For one question about hazards part about the risk index.
Yes.
And how do you?
I saw Emily tapping you. I'm guessing you're doing something similar.
Yeah, emergency response.
Okay. Emergency response. Okay.
So for that part, how do you the index? So which factors you consider for the impact? Like from the civil engineer aspect, like the structural materials, or not, or from the geography aspect.
It's more geographic.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think some of the future, like I talked about, we hope in future years to be doing more resiliency kinds of things. Many of those would be more civil engineering. So can we make better materials that are, more porous, or somehow, I'm not a materials person, so I don't know how you make concrete that's better in fire or whatever, but they have ways apparently of doing these things, and we're hoping to do more research looking at those. But this mapping project is much more about geography and where are the facilities and where do we think we're going to have more of these natural disasters, so that we could make particular facilities more resilient. It's not talking about how we actually do that, or if a facility already is, like it's expected to be flooded, but it's built to flood, and so it doesn't matter that it's expected to be flooded. We're not actually looking at those aspects. But I'm happy to put you in touch with Miguel. He's fantastic. And if you're working on similar things, I think you'd love to. Okay. You know him? Okay. Okay. Then you should get in touch and ask him. Yeah.
So given the changes in Washington, D.C. recently, how financially sustainable is your center? And related to that, will you be hiring postdocs, which I'm sure is a question a number of our students.
Okay. I think that remains to be seen. I don't know how many of you follow American politics, but we've had this large change in government with different ideals. But I would say a lot of the things that we're talking about are things that matter to them as well. So when I talk about, how much is the community involved in some of these projects, I think people on both sides of the political spectrum would say not enough, right? They don't feel like people are getting to have enough input, and they're told, in California, they're told by the government, you will be buying an EV, and they don't feel like they get a choice in the matter if they think that's a good idea or not, right? So this is something that can happen on both sides. So a lot of the projects that we're doing, we hope will still resonate well. And so they will be willing to fund into a third, and the center is up to 5 years. I will say that many in the US are being very cautious about postdocs and even PhD offers right now, just because there's a lot of unknowns. There's both topically things are changing, but also just this idea of shrinking the government and there will just be less funding in the future. So I really don't know how many postdocs we're going to be trying to hire. I do know that they are in the process of hiring a postdoc for the pavement project. So if anybody here actually does that kind of work, they made one offer and then something happened. And so I think they're kind of scrambling to get a new postdoc for that project. But many of the others, the induced demand, the travel demand panel, that research, I believe Susan and Jimmy will be hiring a postdoc on that. So that's of interest as well. And then you said how secure, I think I answered everything you asked. Yeah.
That's interesting in the motorway widening. So just wondering, like, do you reckon we should trade in the city motorways differently as the intercity motorways? Like, do you reckon like widening in the city motorway that connect to city?
Widening them?
Yeah.
No, I think the whole point of it is just the opposite. So the whole point is when we do those widenings, it doesn't actually, for decades, we have thought, well, we need to widen the freeway because there's congestion. We're trying to relieve this congestion. And what we've seen and what we're hoping to do more study on is this idea that it never relieves congestion, basically. So the way to actually go about this is to give people more choices. So yesterday, Emily and I did a whole transit tour of Sydney. People were along for parts of it. And the fact of the matter is there's just going to be congestion in places where you have a lot of vehicles. And you just have to give people a choice so that they're not forced to be stuck in that congestion. If they want to be, then they still can be. We've seen fantastic things. It's not the research we're doing here, but other alternatives are pricing that congestion, right? Across the world, we've seen many cities, including our own New York City very recently, that have had huge gains that by pricing differentially based on different times of day, then people will make different choices if they have to travel in those times or they'll alter their times. And so something like congestion pricing can have huge gains for the people who are actually choosing to travel by car as well, because they're not stuck in the congestion if they are making that choice to pay for it. So, so I think we're advocating for different things than just widen the freeway, because widen the freeway is not solving.
So for example, if we want to like intercity travels in the States, like we reckon it will be the physical alternatives, like apart from like touching the motorway, like
Apart from building a motorway, what's another option?
like, yeah.
So in California, we're hoping it's high-speed rail.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the US, like from one major city to another, I don't think we're gonna get away from automobile travel very soon. But most of the congestion problems are not outside of the city. It's usually within the city itself where we have these issues. So you may not, and I don't know that in most cases, there's even that big of a congestion problem from one city to another, even if the choice is largely automobile, because we just don't have as much travel between cities as we do within a city.
Thank you.
Do you have any specific projects regarding the integration of active mobility and public transport? And what are your challenges in implementing those projects?
Challenges. So I did talk about one here. I think you were in already, but I'll repeat just a little bit. So the idea of that one was the fare connection. So basically, that if you're paying separately for these, it feels like two different modes. You sort of the process, the transfer penalty that you have from one to another feels like a lot. And we think if we could have integrated fare payment, that would be a piece that would help solve some of that. Or even, like I said, subsidizing that if you're paying for a very expensive rail trip, giving you this, $3 scooter trip on the end of it, if it convinces you to take the rail trip, they're perfectly willing to pay for that $3 scooter trip if you're gonna pay for a $20 rail trip, right? So that's the whole idea of that study, is that can we incentivize people to be taking these longer transit trips because of better access on either end of that. So that's one aspect. I would say the challenge of doing these things is that we have many different transit operators. I think you have a similar problem here. Emily and I were talking about this yesterday. And so it's like, literally, like we would have to renegotiate these things for all these different micromobility providers, all of these different agencies. I teach study abroad in the Netherlands, and they have like one big agency that's overseeing most of their rail. They have smaller transit agencies in between, but there's lots of integration to the point where they have one pass. Literally the entire country, you can take a transit trip with this same pass, no matter where it is that you are within the country. And so these kinds of integrations, they've already worked out the problems behind the scenes in integrating the fare media and parts like that. So it's not as hard to think of this other option. And in the Netherlands, they even have bikes at their train stations that you can check out with your train pass and only pay a few euros to have access to a bike for the entire day. So those kinds of programs make it so that they are much more multimodal, and people just assume, I'm gonna take the train to the next town over, there's gonna be a bike, I'm gonna be able to get to anything that I need to get to. And it's much easier to leave the car behind and not even think about that as a way of travel. So I think that's kind of the goal is, you know, within a state like California, could we get to that kind of system where things are much better integrated from a payment perspective? Yeah.
No more questions?
Wait, I got one more question. She knows where to find me, but.
So, just back to the implementation, I'm sure that you had to talk about this in your proposal. And so can you just speak to, you've got the policy brief on induced demand, how you get people to actually act on that at the right level of government?
Yeah.
And then similarly, the whole concept of resilience and what the states is doing is just all over the map.
Yeah.
So how do you connect what you're doing to things on the ground?
Yeah, so we have a lot of money in the budget for the center for us to actually be putting on different forums and things like that, where as the research is being completed, we would be doing lots of inviting various states or, you know, whoever the folks were looking to translate this into policy to these different events. We already did one on induced demand at TRB this year. And so there was a big forum that we hosted in coordination with USDOT and CERRCET and a few other people, where we talked about the induced demand and we presented the policy brief as something that they could access. So I think we take outreach to the next level, and you really have to, and not just academic conferences where Emily and I go and listen to each other's work and chit chat and have a grand time, but there's nobody in the room who's actually going to act on any of the cool things we're doing, but actually being present at more industry-facing conferences to make sure we're actually translating that. Thank you.
So, two things. One, there might be some questions for the chat. Second, we've been talking about induced demand for my entire life, but in my master's thesis, which is more than 30 years ago, I said in a paper that was 30 years older than that, talking about including induced demand and travel demand.
Yeah, and nobody's doing it yet.
And it's very limited in practice.
Yes.
So
why do I think it's going to change?
Aside from computation, what is the real barrier to this? It's not knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not knowledge.
It can't be computation anymore because we were doing it.
No, it's not. I think it's like believing it's true. Like, despite the fact that we have, and this is Kari talk, right? Susan and Jamie could tell you much more. But my own impression is, like, I'm sitting with my husband trying to explain this concept to him, and he just doesn't believe it. He's like, how could that be that they're gonna put this new lane on the freeway and it's not gonna make my commute any better? Like, I think it's just so ingrained, this thought that of course if we build and we put more space out, it's gonna make it better. And I'm trying to explain all the downstream effects and all of these issues. So, I mean, he's someone who builds rail cars for a living, like he's a relatively intelligent engineer, but I think we have people who are doing this kind of work, you know, even if the demand modeler knows that this is true and they would love to represent it. They're answering to politicians who don't believe that a concept like induced demand is true. And so I think similar to what Sue asked, like Susan Kennedy's done like these short clip videos that can be sent out where she very simply explains what is induced demand, because I think we have to get politicians and the public on board with understanding the concept before we're going to be allowed to include it in modeling, even if it's not that big of a challenge to use. That would be the Kari answer. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
again.